So thank you all for joining us over the last 3 days. I know it's been immensely sometimes overwhelming in terms of the presentation that we have brought together over these 3 days. And thank you all again for your forbearance and patience in staying with us all through the time. Anyway, I know this is the bulk of our presentations in terms of this theme, the whole determinism in art vocabularies and the interactions of art and politics in specific historical conditions. And it seems like a mass array of rather uneven landscape in terms of what we talk about, strategies, politics, and even the political, and different types of development. In some ways, it could also be look in a very strange way as how does it fit the bigger picture, like when we talk about new internationalisms as well? Like, I think it comes into the whole analogy that I would borrow from Hamad, the whole pushing hands kind of analogy in Tai Chi. What does it mean to engage in such different circumstances? And even like how, in a certain sense, is there a way that we are cognizant as to like what the gestures as well as the actions that we commit to are read or even interpreted or commodified in many different ways. So, I mean, I'm not, there are a lot of presentations to sum up, and I'm just going to start from the other end of the stage with Max's presentation, because it's easier for me this way in sort of a strangely linear narrative, the summation of the Principal Protesi project in looking at silver. And I know that it was in some ways incomplete because like we were very rushed for time. So I was just gonna go into that and like kind of ask whether there was something else that you wanted to shortly finish up before we proceed on.
Well, I'm not going to use up the whole time we have, but I think actually it was kind of fine. I had planned 2 parts of the presentation, presenting 2 researches I've been involved with, and I simply just presented the first one and not the second one. So I thought it was kind of okay. I mean, to present the second one would be a whole new range of ideas.
I guess it's more like a question for you, Austin, maybe Mustafa, and Harsuno or Enin together. Like the fact that like certain projects emerge out of certain urgencies and certain necessity in dealing with it, but in which that we talk about the proliferation of, like, may we say, the global south. That the question about such resistance and such acts and such necessity of such projects, and slowly how it's being read, let's say, in the uneven landscape. Is there a way that you can avoid is there a way that you would think that you would want to avoid it being read or even commodified, or what does it mean to be commodified in terms of resistance or politics?
It's difficult, the field I work in to get commodified. I wish I could sell my knowledge better, but it's just, it's basically a bit of a poor job. In terms of danger or something, or fear, I would say the danger of fear is the institution, basically, and new forms of institutions that have emerged recently, like more network-organized neoliberal structures, and which label things just simply and superficialize profound kind of research or something. So it's interesting that the very concept of research is already very has turned a very superficial representative issue. So when we were working, for example, with Museo Reina Sofia or Haus der Kultur der Welt in Berlin, there was the fact that we actually had research a lot was very important to museum directors, but most of all because the research thing was already a kind of a label they wanted to know attached to the project. So it had to be a research project. But now actually the outcome, there was no real interest for, like not notable for what we had found out during those years of dialogue and research and so on. It was much more important to state that it was a research project as such. This was a strange experience. Yeah, because as soon as you analyze structures and mechanisms that have to do with value production, then you get in conflicts with the representatives of those institutions, and then it's a contradiction permanently at stake, permanently. So that is a kind of fear I do have, or so, is the always to have to run against the institutions. It's an old song, but it's kind of, for me, it's not clear yet how to escape those mechanisms. Obviously, today what is rather a problem is in education, how education is being privatized and commodified, or so. These and yeah, that is a problem.
I was under the maybe section, so I thought maybe I can escape up from answering. I want to just pick up on this idea of the inescapable, in a sense where I think the kinds of economies that, by economies I don't simply mean the economic economies, but also the kind of cultural and I suppose the global economies that we find ourselves in today, if there is such a thing to begin with. A certain form of commodification is actually quite inevitable. I mean, for instance, when I was speaking yesterday about the project, I resisted from showing any kind of a gallery impression in my presentation very consciously, because I didn't want to somehow suggest that there's been this kind of because I really didn't know how to deal with it, to be honest. When the artists go in and they would sort of produce these works using this figure of Manglauro, I mean, what happens to this man, you see, once he enters the gallery space? And I think it's something that we're still trying to figure out. But I think having said that, the project itself was also trying to somehow understand who this guy is and how does, in many ways, art engage with this, because and what does this mean today, and especially for the visual, and hence there was this kind of a recourse to literature as well sometimes, and in an attempt at perhaps problematically trying to resolve these things, but obviously the resolution is always tenuous. So I think we can.
Okay. I think the problem which art, the interaction between art and politics, I think art take a very important place that it is a kind of sensible distribution or a kind of a aesthetic which can use sensibility or the visual to make the political distribution being redistribute, and I think in a section we discuss about the art itself, which can participate or engage with a kind of antagonism or a fight against something else, or you can make a more subtle distribution in the form itself, in the art form, which combine different elements and the proliferating meanings. And then I think it's quite interesting that in the ancient or in the past decades, there are propaganda or some very obvious subject to protest against or with. But in now in a globalization or new international, we even cannot find an exact object. So I think today is quite interesting that even Ai Weiwei as a phenomenon prevailing over the world, or even like a poem or superficial logic like obscenity, which this is kind of a contextual like a disease, which can very effective. In this way, I think we are all thinking about this kind of form which expands itself and to a very large scale. And in this sense, I think Mark says, the obscenity or gossip which can contagious to pass forward or over the world, I think is very interesting. Like this kind of phenomenal effect, as I think, it's not an affection or a sentiment. It's kind of a very strong, high intensity power that is an affect, which can transfer in or communicate very fast and very big in this way. So like gossip or super flat logic or Ai Weiwei as a virus, something like that. I think it's very interesting what kind of art, forms of art can produce such tremendous amount or quality to have its own phenomenon. So I think I want to raise a little questions that I think for me is I didn't solve the question that, for example, like Mark, you said a movie star, and as a public figure or icon, and there's so many flies or audience to talk about them, and to make gossip to make more kind of contagious to the rest of the audience, right? But it's still kind of a central and the rest of it. So how can we to overcome this kind of a central or iconic or Ai Weiwei, this kind of a central, and we tour it around and then make our forum? I think it's not like fabricate, right? Because in Deleuze, fabricate means like a fabricate. It's very flat. It's without any iconic or idealistic figure or star. So how could this kind of new international or translocal to being a kind of flat, super flat way to make an affect itself being more powerful and without anchor on certain figure? What I want to say is this fabulation itself, could we imagine a certain kind of intensity or flat? Yeah.
It's actually a lead up on this, and this is something I was also just noticing from your timeline, Enin, and it's just the preponderance of groups. And something also, I talked about Malaysia, which I visited for the first time last month, and just the number of groups, artist groups, and again with Thailand, this idea of groups. And I was just thinking about how how groups function also as a way of risk management, and perhaps the risk has changed. So maybe those groups were about, how do we control or dissipate the risk of taking on something political against the government, and if it's a group, it can dissipate this, and who do you take action against? And maybe it's no longer around the government, but it's also about commodification and how the group protects commodification. Because if I think about sort of instances of artists working in groups, so even say somebody like Basquiat and Warhol, their collective works are worth a fraction of what their individual works are worth. If I think of Marcel Jama and the Royal Art Lodge, Royal Art Lodge can't give their stuff away, whereas Marcel Dama is a superstar. And I wonder if the groups these artistic groups are a way that will help us think through this. And I think the Ai Weiwei problem is a classic example, because in a way, it's, Ai Weiwei, in a way, if he's pushing hands, he's sort of lost his balance a little bit. And through getting that power from the market, it becomes sort of consuming. I don't know, I just wanted to put it out there and hear some reflections.
Well, in the case of Indonesia, this group, it's very interesting proposal from Ahmad, but we also have to notice the fact that a group has its own sort of like problem, where in the case of Indonesia, it's probably not only about the strategy to deal with the risk. It also has the other side of the problem of having or working in a group, which is a classic way of avoiding one personal responsibility by saying it's supposed to be a group, Sometimes these situations can bring you into much bigger problem, actually. So I think that's also why the fact that in many cases in Indonesian modern art history, this group actually very much, very hard to maintain as a group. And secondly, easily affiliated with certain sources of power. In the 60s, it's mostly political power or political party. But come to this era of commodifications of it's not the group that can sort of like give us a way to solve or to give us a certain position in this contestation. It's probably actually how we position the so-called artistic practice in relations to community, to society is very important. I would say, and Harsono would probably disagree with me completely in this case. I would say his model of artistic practice is very much about citizen artists, artists working within a real situation of the society. But with certain younger group or artist collective, let's say based in Jakarta, Bandung, and some of them also in Jogja, this way of positioning oneself as artist or citizen artist completely somehow disappear. Or I'm probably wrong in viewing this. They probably, in their mind, they are saying, well, I'm not even an artist, I'm just a member of this society, which completely changed their way of practice and engagement with the society. And this somehow can give them a way of so many flexibility of you can either creating your own model of economic relationship with other institutions or parties or instances, or playing around with the market, or just avoiding them in one way. It's very flexible in a way.
I don't think there's a problem with Ai Weiwei's iconicity, because as Su-Ming Hang really well argued, I think this is very empty. And actually, he's an artist who's quite aware of this emptiness. So when he's, his agency lies in making it, creating it for it to be filled with many different kinds of projections. He's not one who's claiming the essential Ai Weiwei-ness of his persona. And just to add a little bit of very old-fashioned 1990s theory, I would suggest that a solution to this problem of our need to create these icons is what Kaja Silverman proposes as identification at a distance, which is where she's saying if we're looking at it analytically, we cannot get rid of idealizations, even however much we try to. It's not something we can counter with criticality or self-reflexivity, because it's so deeply ingrained in our whole psychological makeup that we cannot change that. But what we can change is calcifying these ideals so that they become essentialized and fixed, but rather have a kind of reflexive relationship to the own idealizations, so that something becomes flexible in there and de-essentialized. It's a very interesting theory from the 90s in Threshold of the Visible World. So maybe that's a way of thinking about these icons again.
I'm not going to join to individual thoughts, but maybe just see some connections that I perhaps saw that came from both yesterday and today. I think it was actually very interesting that Max and Mustafa started the day in relation to the previous section, because somehow the certain, not necessarily disillusion, but let's say the critique that both Hamad and David placed on how the tools that we use to define the contemporary become very minimum, or there might be not the precise terms to actually understand what we do. No, like with David, the 3 C's, or with Hamad, how he's tired on post-colonials, the rest and the West. No, so what I felt from the two when you started was that it felt that both Potosi and what you're doing at the museum, somehow they are new epistemologies of trying to define the contemporary. So the contemporary is not this canonic Euro-American historiography of conceptualism, but the historical body that we embody is connected to religion, to colonial history. So the present is actually thought from something that happened centuries ago, or something that is transhistorical, like religion, or the relationships between religion, history, and politics that emerge in this square. That's one thing. Then another thing was, after listening, like in general, I found, Petra, your talk, that it was interesting to see how you, at the same time, provincialized Europe. Like how Northern Europe, you can actually, both from the aesthetics of your speech, like you can tell, like, well, this is clearly something that comes from a certain place, no? And, well, basically the reality of such a welfare state like Sweden, that this stills of this community center, no, that you want us to know that this is Scandinavia, where literally like the flag appears, no? And you even say that, let's say, completely contrary, like to the bodies and labor in Potosi centuries ago. At the end of your talk, you even said that they are not even there because of the job, no? Like they don't even work. Like the context is so, the sophistication of social democracy is so sophisticated that the people that you portrayed are basically like, well, have historical and social tensions, but it's a very privileged position. No, I'm not saying that it becomes a hierarchy between the context of Indonesia, but when I see them all together, how you made it was that you provincialized Europe, and that was very interesting. Yeah.
I just wanted to a couple of things. One of the things appears through some of the papers in this second part has been this idea of community, but in tandem with an idea about what's been called monumental history. And in relation to, if not in antagonism with one another. And this sense of either a disavowal of community or an erasure of community. and the construction at the same time of a monumental history, mostly by the state, by the nation, by the construction of the nation. And this has been a thread through this part 2, and a very powerful thread. So just a kind of comment generally about part 2. In some ways it highlights part 1 somewhat negatively. You know, one becomes actually very suspicious about the kind of way in which internationalism and after all of that occurs. If one had heard part 2 before part 1, I mean, you know, in another world, then it may have changed the tune in terms of part 1, and the way in which we think about the kind of idealism or utopianism of part 1, the kind of aspirations, if you will, but against the grain. So that was just a kind of general reflection. I mean, the other thing that I just wanted to say was in relation to Hasono, was a very specific question, was in a sense in the context of, you know, in reference to what I was just saying, is this kind of erasure of the Chinese history, I mean literal violent erasure and historical erasure of the history of Chinese people in Indonesia. You came to that quite late in terms of your artistic career, and I wondered in the period, you know, the 70s and the 80s, to what degree you were aware of it, or colleagues of yours were also aware of it, or whether, in fact, in this later period, in these past few years, it's become more evident in some manner.
This is the problem when you're having too much time having conversation directly with an artist. You know, they sort of like. No, this. I think it's. I can say, like, with the case of Harsono, because of his findings also about his father's photographic works that opened the way to his recent project. But in generally, you know, I mean, most Indonesians, like, we are probably like 1 decade, almost 2 decades apart, but we are sort of like experience most of our life under this regime, Suharto regime. So being Indonesian Chinese it's like you are having, like you are a transvestite, probably transgender in a way, you know, in a way that you want to reassure that you are a woman, let's say, for instance. So there is always this constant psychology for me, for instance, as an Indonesian Chinese, to reassure my positions, my thinking, my intellectual endeavor to be accepted as Indonesian. Again and again, up to a point you come into a real conflict of not only these ideals, but it's a real conflict. You start to become fear coming out of your house because you are aware you are trapped in this Chinese look kind of thing. When the 1998 riot happens in Jakarta and Solo, we never experienced that before, at least my generation. So we are constantly want to construct our belief that we are Indonesian. And suddenly, you know, at the end of the day, these real things happens around you and saying, you're Chinese, your body, your life is in danger. It's sort of like give you a big, huge, broken mirror, but you can see fractions of yourself reflecting on it and start searching how can you combine this, you know, and see your whatever, your true self, probably, your true reflection, something like that, I guess. So it comes a bit late for most, I think, for most Chinese Indonesian.
Can I quickly just bring this into an art historical, like a specifically art historiographical box for a minute? Because in Indonesia's case, of course, what we have is an emerging and I would say already very influential narrativization of precisely this history. According to which certain generations up until more or less Reformasi have been characterized by this grouping, for example, and for whom art's social or socio-political function was almost a given. In the context of emerging nationalism, in the context of anti-colonial struggle, in the context of anti-authoritarianism, and so on. And there's since, apparently, according to the prevailing narrative, been a generation emerge post-Reformasi which is absolutely characterised by its individualism. Now, what I think is very interesting here, and it may be nothing more than an observation, is that in Harsono's case, he in fact undertakes precisely the opposite trajectory across that history. So simply the possibility of those parallel and yet, opposite articulations of individual position, I think, is worth noting. And perhaps, if anything, I would say it problematizes that dominant art history, but it also raises some really interesting questions for us that perhaps some of the other papers suggest answers to, about how it might be possible to narrativize both of these things at the same time. I'm not going to presume to offer any, but
I also want to add to some of the things that were mentioned just now in terms of, and I'm kind of going to reference a book that Hamad brought up during his presentation, his Art History Global. And in it, I actually only realized this last night. There is this kind of a very interesting, and if I may even call it a rather angsty article by Sugata Ray in it, where there's this kind of a discussion where they kind of, I think it sort of transpired from this invitation to come and speak about, as I understand it, was Indian art. And when they arrived, there was this, they were told that, you are too Western in that sense, that your lingo is too Western. And there's this, the entire program completely changed. It completely altered in a sense where they just left the entire paper and then just had this rant. And it's in that book. And having noted this, I'm trying to somehow suggest something here in a sense where whilst we have all these kinds of distinctions, right? I mean, we've discussed this quite a bit. The point I'm trying to say here is that there is, and this is a sort of a realm in which I seek refuge in, is this kind of the notion of the curatorial. And within the curatorial, and within that article, there is this kind of, and this kind of goes back to Ruth's point earlier, where she mentioned, and they cite Gayatri Spivak. And in one of Spivak's writings, she uses this term called strategic essentialism, where strategic essentialism is a sort of a ploy. It's a trope. It exists, but it doesn't exist. It's never meant to fully exist. And it's a bit like, for me, watching Pulp Fiction. I mean, Pulp Fiction, let's say, as a movie, does not make sense if you watch it as one. It only makes sense in parts, and it's the fragments that kind of suggest this. And perhaps I think the way to mediate it is, first of all, to bring in context in a very powerful way. And the other thing is to actually look at particular artist practices, and there's a certain amount of agency there in that sense. And if one is to be essentialist, sure, so you could have this kind of a figure of Manglaro, for instance. You see, he's in that way. It's not about his economic poverty or anything, right? I mean, the artist also, and I wish I had more time to actually show that entire film, because Esquilio kind of goes on to say, right? So I asked him, right? I said, what is this? What is this man? Is he the everyday form of resistance and all that stuff, You can talk about Schimmel, you can talk about all sorts of theories here, Disertu, or even that Ben Heimer book, Everyday Life and Cultural Theory, which is kind of very much referencing some of the things you guys spoke about today as well. But coming back to it, the point I'm simply trying to make is that, and Esquilio says that, it's going to sound very cliched saying this, he actually says this, but Manglaro for him is the idea of a changed man. And he says, I wish we could all just be like that, but we can't, and we've somehow gotten ourselves clogged up in this. It's very idealistic in that sense, I understand that, but sometimes I think it's important to also engage with that. I'm not sure if I'm making sense, I'm just rambling and putting stuff out there, which people can react to. And I agree with you, Charles, in a sense as well. There was this kind of a odd complex that emerged, when the first section and the second half, and then suddenly there's this kind of a realization that where the hell were all these guys, when these discussions were going on? That kind of a thing, like, oh, wow, where did you come from? That kind of a thing. And I think it's interesting for me. It's interesting because there's something to talk about. Yeah. And I don't know, it's just my thoughts.
Maybe I just by way of bringing the two sessions together, I was thinking about this problem that maybe has been talked about, which just sort of elaborating on, which was sort of this question actually of the reception of art within a particular situation, right? And if we think about specific exhibition formats, like the Biennial or the exhibition, or the Biennial maybe, right? And of course, Charles was talking about this sort of feeling that might be sort of not working, right, in this sort of contemporary context, and relating that to a certain kind of politics of inclusion and exclusion. Because Biennial, like you were talking about the zones of contact and how, there's this like overwhelming, sense of we're bringing together, sort of international and multicultural into one place. And of course, the danger of that, in one sense, is this feeling that it can very easily sort of turn into a sort of United Colors of Benetton kind of situation, right? And it seems to me that maybe one of the questions that needs to be asked is really what is the politics of inclusion with relationship to the reception of a biennial in the place that it happens, right? Because if you think about the already existing multicultural environment within certain cities and all of the kind of tensions that exist, and how that relates to something like a biennial, because it's very easy for the biennial to sort of create a kind of bubble of its own, a kind of community of its own, which basically doesn't really connect to anything that's sort of happening in a particular place. And but then the problem, of course, is that there are all of these sort of, one thing would be like racial tensions, for example, which exist but then are totally invisible. And I think, how is it possible to sort of uncover these sort of disavowed or sublimated, tensions that are already there, even without bringing people from elsewhere to a place, that's just sort of something.
One of the things that came out of the Biennale, which Sydney Biennale in 2006, was which was very peculiar. Two small things. One, that people from the Balkans, it had to do partly with language, but people from the Balkans, even though their fathers and mothers had fought one another and killed one another, they hung out together. So, this was very odd in a way, And the second thing was that actually, for example, the Andean community, a large Peruvian community, for example, had a relationship to Peru which was almost folkloric. It had to do with the Peruvian past, it had to do with Andean past, it had to do with Andean folk music. It had nothing to do with the contemporary. And in fact, the people who related to what was going on of the artists from the Andes were not Peruvian, not Bolivian, not Ecuadorian. So there's this strange kind of tension where, because it was in 15 venues, so one of the venues was out in a region where a lot of people from South America, from the Andes, lived. They couldn't connect to it. because it was to do with what was going on in contemporary Andes, not to do with the past. And so, and other people went and were interested. So there was almost a kind of inversion of expectation.
I just wanted to remind everyone that actually the idealism that went in the first part of was not about internationalism. In fact, it was surprisingly little so. People opted mostly for very materialist approaches and fragmented that notion very much. If there was any idealism, it was more about this unspoken term of solidarity that wasn't very much addressed, and because of that was somehow left as an idealism in the room. And the difference I see most of all is that the one that has put the majority of the artists in the second part and the majority of the non-artists in the first part, which is probably the only thing I would very much like to criticize about this conference, because it doesn't make much for solidarity, and I think also in terms of theory production together, it's a problem.
But this was quite random. This aspect was quite random. I think the distribution of professions and of degrees of involvement. So it was not calculated in this way.
Yeah, I'm just remembering some other relations that were between the speakers. Also, like how the discussion migrated to realism as a form that could also be a way to try to define these contemporaneities. And I think I found that in many of those that spoke on realisms, they brought some kind of again another epistemology that does not necessarily see the contemporary as being in the canon of the minimalist or merely the conception, no, but that there's something analytical and revolutionary, as you placed it, within certain ramifications of realism in art in China, no? That, well, I don't know, I mean, most of the archetypes and the imagery that you brought in relation to the project that had to do with religion and Filipino history, well, it does come from trying to see that what are those archetypes that are not necessarily those things that are dematerialized, no? So not to have the weight that only what is contemporary is the dematerialization of an object. And I think that's why it was so interesting that also two of the speakers spoke about iconography, no? The importance of iconography in contemporaneity when you brought pop culture. I mean, there were two speakers that brought pop culture, Nadim and Mr. Mark, who, well, I mean, there were two ways of understanding it, no? And I don't know, maybe I think that at the beginning you wanted to have more discussion with Nadim, and maybe it would be interesting also to see that how, I don't know, you both differentiate these approaches of how you relate pop culture in its constructions of subjectivities, desire, taste, no, sexuality, you know.
That we've seen quite a good variety of realisms today. And I'm thinking, you know, from the kind of schematic diagram that we had right through a lot of these, you know, quite distinct and dispersed art histories. And yet there has been a certain consistency to the realisms that we've seen. One of the ways we might try to describe that is that in every story, at some point, there has been either the attempt or the achievement of an association of the realist, or the realistic, or the social real, with some kind of political advancement or progress, right? So to get it into very sort of broad terms. And yet, also we've seen that some of those realisms, so-called, verge on other things, and particularly with generational and economic change. So I just wanted to remind us that, you know, it's perhaps not by accident that for Greenberg, who has been cited here today, you know, it's in fact kitsch. You know, Norman Rockwell takes him in one step to Soviet Socialist Realism in the famous essay. So.
Maybe, yeah, I mean, just relating to this thing with Mark, and something that Hamad said to me just now, actually, which I think it should be pointed out. I mean, I was pushing this notion of precarity, right? And actually, it's borrowed. I borrowed it from Hirschhorn. And actually, it's also something that is sort of cropped up quite a lot recently, you know? And Borio talks about it, and I don't know, other people talk about it. I mean, yesterday it was Anna talked about it. And of course, the danger here is that, you know, even if I might think that it's relevant in this sort of situation, it is in danger of becoming fetishized in itself as a kind of method, right? And I think that the important thing is to always sort of be aware of that, and just sort of keep in mind that there is never any last word on anything. I mean, and that maybe something like this conference has to sort of constantly happen for these things to sort of be pulled out. And relating that back to Mark's, you know, sort of trajectory. I mean, there's definitely a kind of overlap, I think, in our discussion. But of course, in the specificities are very different, and I think it's those specifics that are very important in sort of drawing these questions out into the open.
Yeah. Maybe I could just say a couple of things. I mean, I hope it's quite obvious. I imagine it is that I've presented an incredibly utopian vision of gossip. You know, I left out all the negative affects, all the nasty elitism, the damage to others, the damage that may remain within the self by participating in such gossip, and that is intentional in what I'm doing to try to get at what I see as the productivity of this discourse, building on the feminist theorists who I mentioned at the beginning, but in talking to Inan at coffee briefly, he rightly brought up when does, in a sense, gossip become conspiracy theory? And so I was very happy for that. And when, in that sense, how can we then, as we were talking about it, how to make some distinctions between gossip and rumor, conspiracy, gossip and scandal, and I was, I'll say two things. I mean, about that, I was thinking then that I know for the context that I'm speaking about, I'm trying to think of gossip really as, and I think gossip as a situated knowledge, and in a sense that rumor tends to be the more privileged object of philosophers. If you go through, even the privileged object to hate, but like Heidegger, Walter Benjamin, who I love more than Heidegger, makes a distinction between gossip and between rumor and gossip, where rumor is the good one because rumor is, as he says, ecstatic. So it has this ecstasies. It doesn't remain centered. Maybe like Austin was saying, it doesn't remain. It's constantly on the move. Whereas gossip gets tied down in the trivialities of everyday life, of people idling at the water heater or the water dispenser in the coffee machine, and and is tied to the trivialities of everyday life in its action and in the object of its discussion. But it's exactly, there are times, what I find interesting, and I am just adding some issues here, and then I just want to finish by just coming back to Nadim, but that there are certain subjects that traverse that boundary between gossip and rumor. There are times when issues of homosexuality become affairs of state, in a sense. When then the trivial, the typical domain of gossip can take on a gravity. It may have to do also with, I think, the very interesting and relevant issue of risk, of when risk, living in times of risk, forces people or gives people a sense that they feel that they need to bond together and to employ certain, I won't take that long, employ certain strategies, but also they need to then themselves be risky in their strategizing, in their coming together, and in their thinking, in their speculating. Okay, I'm somewhat associating here, but maybe just to come back to the relationship between what Nadim and I, and my question I posed to him earlier. So in my attempt to sort of privilege gossip and discuss it in a kind of utopian way, and even to think about the images that get circulated, if you grant me that, within gossip, I guess I'm looking at typically trivialized images, maybe generic images, and trying to say that they indeed are in some specific situations not generic. They are not poor. They are indeed very rich. If one leaves the realm of the purely aesthetic and tries to think the aesthetic with the social, in that sense. And that's, I think, what I was trying to understand in relation to even the final, very provocative clip that you showed. Another one that we need the next conference to see all of these clips in their entirety, but another one I would love to see in its entirety, where we see this man who came to present his sadness. I don't know why, I don't know what he thought, what image he wanted to generate, and I don't know how he felt about the image that Koizumi wanted to make of that, or Koizumi's second-degree reflection on the generic image of a crying man and a cute cat, or so that's sort of what I'm trying to think is the social and the aesthetic together in our analysis of an aesthetic experience.
I mean, yeah, I think the triviality is really important here because simply because it's overlooked, right? And because it's overlooked, it's embedded with these sort of, again, this sort of disavowed or sublimated ideology, it's sort of, and if you look into the trivialities, you can sort of find or maybe uncover or rediscover things that are already there, but which you can't see for some particular reason. And it's sort of, and it's only possible in that situation because triviality is something which sort of, if you're sort of enacting a trivial situation, you are both the victim and the executioner in a way. I mean, you can't, if you analyze something from a distance, then there's a sort of sense in which you can sort of put it within a sort of reasonable sort of theoretical framework. But if you're at the same time you're sort of enacting a triviality, your own ideologies are also embedded in that act itself. So there's a sort of complicity that is happening, and yeah. So.
I was just wanting to delve a little bit on like what Inti had said earlier, because I think what was quite remarkable about yesterday, for example, in the association between the first three presentations was that indeed while Max and Mustafa were both talking about different ways of expanding the aesthetic field of the contemporary in a way, and looking at different attempts to integrate in this aesthetic horizon different forms and different references and different I wouldn't call them not languages, but different forms and while this was happening, Anna's talk was looking at like how at precisely the apex of the aesthetic expectation of our contemporary times in a way, and of like exactly that form that is sort of ideal and best capturing, you know, the horizon of expectations, of values, and of desires of the current system. So I'm very interested in this contrast, and maybe asking all the three of you how you related to this, or like how do you see this? Maybe starting with Anna. So how do you see the background on which the precursors?
Yeah, it's well, there is something that you said that there is also this, you know, permanent contradiction, and I think this is towards the institution. And I was aware, and I'm still aware actually while we're talking, I always have some kind of a parallel that I really talk for a very specific position that almost become a kind of provisional, but at the end it's not at all a naive position, because it's the one that somehow dictates the market, and then, you know, the market dictates the canon, and then the narrative, and so on. And also in the moment where there is a kind of there are proposals, and there is also a kind of a wish to shake the canon, or at least to find the ways how to incorporate other narratives in the dominant canon. And then you talked about the fact that you're afraid of the labels, no? The network who are putting labels, and putting labels under this also kind of for the same reason that I just mentioned. I think that you're also referring to this network, which is Reina Sofia and other museums, no? That they have this, actually I don't know, there is a kind of a wish to research and to know more, but then there is actually the label of the research, and then you're in the museum. But then once you're in the museum, you also become visible in a kind of, you know, because always the museum it's a public place. And I was just thinking when you mentioned the group, you know, and then there is. Because when I think, for example, about the group in the practices of the 60s and the 70s, and, for example, former Yugoslavia, where I come from, it was also a way of it was a kind of a position in a way. I mean, although at the end it turned out that there was no such a strong political opposition in the art in the 60s and the 70s, that it also is a kind of a myth in a way, at least in Yugoslavia. But it was much more in a film, for example, than in artistic practices. But then in the 90s, like after the war, particularly in 2000, there was this dynamic of the group is very present in, for example, in curatorial practice, in the like cultural production are in the practice also, because there is not this institution of what I'm talking yesterday, but just also, you know, not to talk only from this position. So there is suddenly like all the curators who are suddenly making group, because there is no institution, and there is a need to understand what happened, to understand, to also somehow there is a kind of a dominant politics and dominant way of dealing with history that you need also to oppose. So actually there is all a group, and there is all. And it's interesting because I participated in quite a lot. There was like in former Yugoslavia in the last decade, like a lot of. they still call them some collectives also, you know, and they were like different. It was a kind of also of a normalization after the war in a good and a bad way, but we never called ourselves networks. And it's somehow, you know, this network is so much present, so as if the kind of a collective is the utopia of the socialism, and now the network is a living utopia of the capitalism. So there is something that, when you're talking, no, because kind of Reina Sofia is a good institution in a way, you know, in if you, and then there is also this friction with the institution in the sense of the, I can't. And then, you know, there are different, of course, the scale of the institution, the context institution change a lot. But, you know, it's these things of the, and for me, it's interesting, while, for example, MoMA, you working as a curator, you are so faced with this one medium, you know, you can't really, so you face the medium, and like in this moment, the medium I'm in charge of somehow is the hot one, you know, it's the one everybody is discussing it. And that's why I thought it's not a game, because it's also not naive for the reasons that I said yesterday. And it's always, and again, there's a big tension. I know when we work with Martha Rosler to do a garage sale, she's still now, she's kind of denying what she did, because actually to put the project that she did in some campus in 73 in the heart of the MoMA, it was a bit disturbing. Like that, does it lose its, you know, political potential or not? It's I don't know, Cosmin, if I'm answering your question, because I'm like throwing out, you know, all the.
Well, I don't know if it was a question that really deserved to be answered, but yeah. I think.
Sorry. Yeah.
No.
There's actually just a small comment. Maybe this is actually a question. We have been in the last 2 days, the term social realism or the social real has actually been used quite a lot. And maybe my comment and my question, I will reveal the fact that I have no idea about art history or art theory. But I'm a bit surprised by this unproblematic use of the term because what do we mean by realism? There are many theories and schools about realism. And what does it... It's one thing to play, maybe there's an art historical period, but there's also what does it mean to talk about the social real today, considering the history we have had globally in different parts of the world. But for example, like when I talked about the audience and the stage, and of course you can see like kind of relations to Brecht, of course. And he said that the real art, realistic art, is about revealing economical and political relations. That doesn't mean that it has an indexicality. It's about revealing those relationships. And then from Trinh Minh Ha, for example, in the 70s and 80s, she said there is nothing we can call the real. It's all about conventions, and it's all about constructions. It's about what we have agreed on, what we can call real or what we can call reality. So this is a kind of a... So I'm a bit puzzled how to think of that, of the notion of the social real. What is it? Yeah.
Well, I mean, maybe from our perspective, before maybe both Anthony and Mustafa can especially address this, is because I think your comment pinned exactly what we want, or like the problem that we wanted to address with the second thematic field of indeed how certain vocabularies have different circulations and they're determined very differently in different contexts. Because indeed it's, you know, I don't know what problematic means, but of course, you know, it's not, you don't get anywhere. It's an empty any such term is, you know, an empty signifier, or it's a totally unfunctional definition if they're not discussed in particular contexts and in particular situations. I think if we take, I mean, socialist realism, of course, is one of the most loaded categories of the 20th century, of the art of the 20th at different moments in different decades of the 20th century, it had collapsed and stopped under the heaviness that it had sort of accumulated in this context one by one. I think what was very interesting when we were discussing with Mustafa about his presentation, about the premises of his presentation, was the relative anomaly of the case of the Philippines, where something that was actually called more social realism than socialist realism was still surviving well into the 80s, and I guess your point would be that it's actually surviving today. But it was surviving in the 80s, as very close to the principles of the historical socialist realism, while having some of the political potency and agency that was only ideally claimed by socialist realism somewhere else. And that's because this was the language of the opposition towards the regime, because socialist realism was still in the 80s in the Philippines able to capture, to position itself as the most potent and politically viable art language to address the aspirations of the Filipino people that, was not finding themselves represented in the Marcos regime. And that's partially indeed because of artists like Chabet, who were very successful in actually expressing all the aspirations of the Marcos regime in their own art. I think because of situations like that, social realism had like a very particular history in the Philippines in a particular decade than it had, in China by that time. So, of course, only if we take that decade, the 1980s, and we look at these two countries across the sea, however you want to call that sea, the same, basically the same artistic language had almost opposing positions in a kind of like political equation.
I think the reason why I was talking about the 1980s, the reason why I went back to 1920s is exactly to answer your question. It's about the definition of realism. Actually, there has been a whole history of misunderstanding and misuse of the idea of realism in Chinese art, like I briefly mentioned today. But actually, the reason why all offer accurate, although it's a misuse, that it serves certain purposes. In the beginning, in the 20s, actually the import of what called realism or critical realism is together with another movement of changing the written language of Chinese from an old form of language called Wenyan, which is different from oral language, so it's only understandable by elite, to something exactly like oral language, which is understandable by all the people. So the two things are comparable as a project of standardization, of a tool of communication throughout the whole country, because China is such a vast country that it's very important to have a standardized tool to convey messages to every part of it. So the very original reason why realism was important was that. And then, like I said this morning, it was a whole history of misuse because of political propaganda and everything. And another thing I want to say is that this project of standardization actually didn't success, even if the Communist Party tried very hard using this kind of ideological scheme. Very important concept that I didn't mention today in our presentation is the regionalism in China, because regional culture is a very important thing that the so-called totalitarian rule of the Communist Party always want to get rid of it, but wasn't able to do it. For example, Cultural Revolution is a huge project to standardize the whole China by moving away all the cultural specificity of regions in China, but it wasn't that successful. Actually, the different attempts, different trajectories to get away realism, like the modification of realism or the breaking away of the concept of artists too, are actually contribution of different regional cultures in China. This point I haven't mentioned. This one is a very under-researched perspective in Chinese art. But we talk about internationalism in day one. Although I wasn't here, but it's we can think that China consider itself as international. So China consider itself as a war. So we can talk about provincism in China. So different provinces, different countries, and it's a very interesting thing is the so-called multiculturalism has always existed in China. That the ethnic minorities are always considered to be exceptions. That even in the most terrible totalitarian rule, that the ethnic minorities are considered to be exception in art and everything. So yeah, I hope it makes sense. Yeah.
I think it's very interesting just that you described then China's nationalism as trying to do away with regionalisms as a internationalism, and it just makes me think back to David's statement yesterday that kind of provocation. Maybe we cannot have. There will be no internationalism without regionalism. Sort of in his talk, I don't know if that. It was just a nice association that came to mind.
I do want to attempt trying to answer that, and I'm going to answer it with an anecdote. I'm not going to talk about, but what I am going to do is I'm going to talk about.
Why?
Because I'll give you an example, and it kind of answers your question. First of all, there's always been a distinction between socialist realism and social realism, and there's this book called Eye of the Beholder, which was published in the 90s. It's edited by T.K. Savavat, and it brings together some interesting essays. And in it, there is one essay by Patrick Flores, which is kind of also goes back to what Erica was talking about yesterday, when there's this one lunar painting from the 19th century, and it's called Parisian Life. And it's this image of this female figure who is kind of a little coy almost, and kind of extending herself, seated in a cafe somewhere in Paris. And at the far end of the painting are three figures. There's Luna himself, there is Rizal before their return to the Philippines, and there is the figure who eventually went on to collect the painting. He was also partly the commissioner of the painting. And in the 90s, what happened was the Philippines Pensions Board, and I have to factually correct this, but it's basically the government body that maintains the nation's pensions, bid for it and decided to acquire it and bring it back to the Philippines. And of course, a significant amount of money was spent. I mean, this is after all one Luna. And the claim that was made was that this is the nation's heritage. This is a piece of history. This is not. And of course, there is a lot of discussion about what the female figure was. No, I mean, they claim that it was this kind of, she was resembling the figure of the Philippines in terms of the map, in terms of the cartography. She's also perhaps a prostitute, whatever. And Patrick Flores documents not simply the kind of the repatriation of the painting, but actually what happened and the debate that emerged in the Philippines. And I'm telling you why social realism in the Philippines is very much alive is because there's this one instance where the painting is taken all across the country, and then there is this one meeting where school teachers are brought to see this painting. And a school teacher actually throws her umbrella at it and says that, can I cook this and can I eat this now? You know, you brought Luna home, but what now? You see? And in many ways, this goes back, I think, to the point in the 90s when, considering these kinds of things that are happening, and this is actually true for the Malaysian case, but that's a different issue altogether. Malaysia, Philippines, Indonesia is a different beast, I think, altogether. But there is this attempt at participating in biennales, you see, and this kind of the internationalism that is in the air, of the 90s. But there's always this gap I've noticed. You see, there's a gap between what one may call, the participation and the context that these sites represent. And it's this gap that is interesting to explore for me. And that is why social realism, I mean, of course, some of the social realists in the group would say, oh, it's dead, you're 20 years too late. But there's also people like Habulan who still says that I'm a social realist. So what does this mean then? So it's that gap that keeps it alive, I suppose.
I just want to throw out in a very abstract sense the term of speculative realism, having gone through a lot of other realisms in the last few minutes here, which, of course, in the contemporary philosophical sense, refers to this assertion that there is a real, but that it is unknowable or unperceivable. And I think that while it doesn't relate directly to aesthetic realism, that might be an interesting proposition for artistic practice in our current moment, where it seems that there's a lot of gesturing at a social real without actually coming into contact with it. There's kind of a sense of modeling without interfering. I'm thinking particularly in terms of Nadim's work with this Hollywood imaginary that becomes perverted into something else entirely, or these ideas of how images are circulating outside of their original real context, and just wondering how that attempt to create another real might be more productive than it is descriptive, and if we could actually think of a form of realism that would not be imitating a real, but rather producing a real.
Well, science fiction, that would be my answer, I think. It's my favorite genre.
I'll just say one thing. I don't know that I have anything directly to say to the realism, but the speculative notion. One of the things that I thought was interesting, also in Rabi Emrue's contribution in absentia, is this speculation about the on-screen and the off-screen, and which. It's an incredibly powerful example that he's talking about there, but it's a very similar thing to what I'm talking about in gossip, which is about, which is sort of how I end up defining a gossip image, is a kind of speculation about a relationship between an off-screen and an on-screen, and then bringing, but not in a sense to get to a real. And I don't know enough about the writing on speculative realism to know what that real then is, but in a sense not to get to a real, but to generate a different, again, this kind of fabulation, this different image. And I thought of that in relation again to Nadim and sort of trying to think of the relationship between on-screen, off-screen, and I guess just different ways of thinking about that. And one can then take the off-screen as quite concretely that which, as Rabi Emrue does at first, is just the person making the film is off screen, the cameraman is off screen, but then Emrue does a typical, let's say, I don't want to gossipize the world, but a typical gossip move in relation to what I'm saying, where he tries to find in the on screen some connection to the off screen in order to make that link. And then he metaphorizes the off-screen, where it becomes then, it's both concrete and metaphoric, as it almost always is in cinema, where it is the place of death then. But if we think of it in relation to Roland Barthes' writing on photography, where in a sense it's a similar with his notion of the punctum, where then there's a kind of off-screen, if you will, that is a place of life, which is maybe then related to the speculative realism, but I'm not entirely sure about that. I mean, the place of life because it connects to, the fact that this photograph is a moment of frozen death, let's say, in Barthes' melancholic writing, and that indeed then the off-screen is the recognition that someone lived beyond, that there was another time, a space, that it continued, and so that there was life going on there. So these are just some thoughts, I think, to maybe then also try to process that incredibly dense offer that Emroy made in his move between on-screen, off-screen, and life and death.
I think that now I will really have to sadly close this session and the conference in this go. I would like to thank all of you very, very much for coming all the way to Hong Kong, or, you know, all the way from where you were to Admiralty. And also to thank to the participants from the previous session. And to really, really, really warmly thank the Asia Society. And I would like to actually invite Alice to say a few words on behalf of our wonderful and generous hosts.
Thank you. I have to say this has been a wonderful day for me to be able to stay for most of this afternoon to hear all of you. This is what the center is built to do. There was a vision 12 years ago to have a center like this, and it took a long time to get it done. And now that we've only been open a year, a little bit over a year, and we're delighted to be part of this. Thank you, Cosmin, for inviting us to take part. And we will be doing more programs like this, partnering with organizations internationally as well as locally, as well as, and if you had a chance, I really wish our show, Eminent Domain, Designing the Life of Tomorrow, was still on. It just closed a few weeks ago. And I really encourage you to grab this. It's free, thanks to Create Hong Kong. And Kingsley's here. Maybe Kingsley will autograph a copy for you. But it's really featuring 12 Hong Kong designers. It was the first the show that we mounted here at Asia Society Hong Kong Center. And previously we did 2 with our colleagues in New York. And we have some really exciting exhibitions coming up. One is opening May 15th, talking about Light Before Dawn, unofficial Chinese unofficial art, 1974 to 85. I know Anthony's talk this morning was part of that. So please come back for that exhibition. And then we're also very delighted that a few weeks ago we signed an agreement with Guggenheim that we will be bringing No Country, the contemporary South and Southeast Asian art show, to Asia Society Hong Kong in October. So please come back and be part of that. And again, we're honored and delighted to be kind of venue hosts. And Cosmin, congratulations on an excellent conference. And I look forward to what I missed to see it on the web, because people have been telling me what a great this 3 days has been. So congratulations to you and your staff for an excellent conference. So thank you.